Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 9th session of the Tech and Innovation Center series, part of the Local Infrastructure Hub. As you join the Zoom and get settled in, I'll welcome you to share your name, role, and organization in the chat. I also want to invite you to answer a trivia question I have for you, which is, can you identify this building on this slide? If so, drop it in the chat, and I promise you it's relevant for today's conversation. My name is Tina Walla, and I'm the Chief Partnerships Officer at US Digital Response, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit that provides pro bono technology support to governments. This series is a part of the Local Infrastructure Hub, which aims to help America's towns and cities take full advantage of federal infrastructure funding by helping to create competitive, winning bids that deliver real results for residents. This session is brought to you by Cornell Tech and US Digital Response and is supported by our funders, Bloomberg Philanthropies, Ballmer Group, Emerson Collective, Ford Foundation, and the Kresge Foundation. Now, before I move on from this slide, I'm just going to do a quick check in the chat. I don't see any guesses yet. So the answer to the trivia question is this photo, I'm told, is of the house at Cornell Tech, which is apparently the most energy efficient high-rise in New York. How about that? All right, if we can go to the next slide, I'll share a brief refresher on our series for those of you who may be new. So, what we're trying to do here at the Tech and Innovation Center with this series is to inspire local government leaders like all of you about the integration of technology that improves city infrastructure now and into the future. We have 4 key values that guide this series, as shown on this slide. First, we're driven by shared goals. We do not believe in technology for technology's sake. Second, we want to design for people. We believe that technology processes and products have to reflect the deeply diverse needs of deeply diverse people and individuals. We're not all the same. Third, we believe in approaching this work with a commitment to resourcing this work. I know that in this moment, it feels like there's a lot of funding opportunities out there. We want to think about long-term sustainability, and that includes planning for workforce, policies, and regulation. Last but certainly not least, we want to build for trust. Tech and innovation should deliver solutions that are transparent, reliable, secure, durable, and mindful of privacy considerations. Now, today we're going to be highlighting, this was the teaser with the trivia, we're going to be highlighting the Department of Energy's assistance to jurisdictions related to energy code reform. And I am so excited to hear about the work of Fort Collins, Colorado, to get the city perspective. Before I introduce our speakers, I'm going to invite Kara Ekholm from Cornell Tech to ground us in some context about today's topic and discussion. Kara, over to you.
Great, thank you. And thanks to everyone for joining us. So I'm sure you're here today because you recognize that decarbonizing buildings is the most important thing we can do to combat climate change. And I say that because the built environment contributes 42% of global carbon emissions. So to think about that breakdown, I included this chart here that shows that buildings collectively comprise 27.3% from their operation, so that's energy use, and 7.7% from what's called embodied carbon, so that's energy contained within building materials. And then the remainder of that 42% is coming from the delivery of new infrastructure projects. But you can see here that 27% that comes from the operation of buildings is really critical to combating climate change. Go to the next slide. Thanks. And the best thing we can do in order to combat operational carbon in buildings is to focus on energy codes as a primary lever for reducing energy usage. So just for some quick background context, in the United States, ASHRAE is a standards organization that sets minimum energy standards for buildings in most US cities and states. So cities and states have to elect to adopt ASHRAE standards that are updated on a regular basis. The reason I wanted to include this map is just to showcase that across the United States, states are at varied points with respect to their ASHRAE adoption journey. So you have states like, let's say, Oregon here, who are on 2018, or then you have states like South Dakota that are still on the 2009 standards. And so part of the intention behind the DOE grants we're going to be hearing about is to try to help level the playing field and get everyone up to the latest ASHRAE standards. In addition, we have the state level code, but then individual cities will often elect to go above and beyond the minimum set by the state. Fort Collins, who's with us today, is a great example of that. Has been able to work with the DOE and now work with other cities to also try to incorporate net zero energy code provisions. If you want to learn more about where your jurisdiction is in this journey, you can check out this helpful map, which we'll link in the slides that are sent out after the session. Tina, back over to you.
Thanks, Garrett. So with all of that in mind, I am so excited to welcome our two speakers for today. If we can go to the next slide, thank you. So first, I want to welcome Aaron Bedingfield with the Department of Energy. And I also want to welcome Brad Smith, who again is with the city of Fort Collins and is going to give us that city perspective on what does this mean and what does it look like to translate this type of reform at the city level. And before I jump into learning about the work that our panelists are leading, we'd like to take a moment to ask you two poll questions. First, where is your community on its energy code journey? And second, how have you been engaging with your state regarding updating your energy code? While you're responding to that, Aaron and Brad, I'll suggest you take a look at the results when they pop up so you get a sense of where our audience is in their journey. All right. Well, you get that last response to a poll question in. We can take our slides down and Aaron, I'm going to start with some questions for you. So first, I'm appreciating that the Department of Energy has a few different programs to provide technical assistance to state and local governments who are looking to adopt advanced energy codes. Oh, there's those results.
Oh, yes.
So Aaron, can you, sorry to make you multitask, but can you give us a quick overview of the DOE's different programs?
Yeah, and I might just based on seeing the results and seeing that folks are kind of earlier in the process for the most part, I might just start by saying, energy codes are part of a broader suite of codes. They dictate what the minimum energy performance for new construction and large renovations is. And DOE has been involved in the energy code space for decades. So we provide a whole lot of technical assistance and guidance and analysis. Every 3 years, the model energy codes are updated. Those are ASHRAE, which you just heard about, and also the International Energy Conservation Code, the IECC. And so every 3 years, DOE does an evaluation of whether those new updated codes are more energy efficient than the prior version and issues what's called a determination to just assure the market that this new version of the energy code is more efficient than the prior. We also work with our partners in the national labs to give sort of state and local level analysis as state and local governments are thinking about adopting newer versions of the codes with potentially some amendments. We can provide analysis and support to tell those folks whether or not the version of the code that they're pursuing is more efficient than their prior. We also track adoption of state and local codes and the adoption process and the enforcement process and the compliance process. You can find all that information for your state at energycodes.gov. And then some localities are also tracked on there. And then we provide some tools for implementation support. So things like ComCheck and ResCheck, which run plans or building designs against the latest codes and say whether or not they're compliant, and then track the data that come in through there. We also develop research and guidance. So going beyond the model codes, going beyond the latest codes, we provide things like plugins or analyses of innovative code approaches like building performance standards. We provide just sort of national level guidance on those things. And I'll say in the last couple of years, we've seen really unprecedented investment in the code space. And so we're now able to, as an agency, grant out funding for adoption and implementation as a result of bill and IRA. And so we have $1.25 billion across our agency to grant out in support of state and local governments adopting and implementing more current codes than they have. And I'm happy to dive into the details and the nuance of those things as it's helpful.
That is a pretty incredible spectrum, because that's, so DOE is working on not just the standards and the research and some guidance, but also with the funding, you're supporting implementation and making the change on the ground, which is really exciting, I think, for a lot of us city govies on the call. Let me ask you, with that in mind, that every 3 years you're putting out sort of new guidance, what should cities be striving for when they think about code modernization? It sounds like it may be that sometimes we're moving the needle. So how would you suggest cities orient to this opportunity to modernize their energy code?
Yeah, so it's I work in the DC area, and it's the favorite answer to say it depends. And it really depends in this space. So depending on how your jurisdiction is positioned. So in some cases, cities can adopt their own building codes or building energy codes. And in some cases, cities are beholden to what's adopted at the state level. In some cases, cities can adopt a stretch code at the state level or go beyond what the state does. And so it really depends from the adoption perspective. It really depends on how you're positioned in terms of your authority to adopt your energy codes at the local level. And so I'd say if you are positioned to adopt energy codes at the local level, take stock of where you're at, see where your codes are, where your compliance and enforcement processes are, and see where there's an opportunity to update those to either the latest model codes or to go beyond where it's possible. And then if you're not in a position to adopt locally, you're still in a position to work with your state government to pursue adoption at the state level, or you're still in a position to help the state implement the code. And so I'd say starting by taking stock of where you are energy code wise in the space of your authority in your jurisdiction, and then seeing where there's opportunities to push and opportunities to engage. Regardless of how you're positioned from the adoption perspective, I'd say most of the time, and Brad, I'm sure, is going to speak a lot more to this, most of the time the enforcement falls to the locality, regardless of where the authority to adopt falls, just because that's where the permitting office is, that's where the building compliance offices are. So even if you have a state code and you don't adopt it at the local level, odds are the enforcement is happening at the local level. So that's also an opportunity to engage with your state to make sure that you're implementing the code that they've adopted, and there's a two-way information stream from the state to the locality.
Interesting. That's a great point that for folks on the call, I see there's some jurisdictions from Maine and Rhode Island and Virginia. That's a really great reminder that enforcement happens at the local level. And so I think that's an important lever for cities to be aware of. One more question for you, Erin, before I go to Brad. And this might be a basic question, but what is an advanced building energy code? And then what are zero energy building provisions? Can you help me just on the language? What are those two terms?
Yeah, it's not a basic question. It's a complicated question, and different people have different definitions. So I'll say from the DOE funding perspective, we have a couple of buckets. One came from Bill, one came from IRA, Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act. I'm working on my acronyms, y'all. So $250 million, $225 million, you might have seen come out through RESI or RECI, the Resilient Efficient Codes Implementation Program. So that is for just adopting a more current code. So from a perspective of a jurisdiction, that might be an advanced code for that jurisdiction. So that funding is for that purpose. We have $1 billion from the Inflation Reduction Act to adopt the latest model codes, which in our statute are ASHRAE 90.1 2019 for commercial, and the International Energy Conservation Code 2021 for residential, and the zero codes. So from the perspective of our statute and what's out there right now, the zero codes are appendices in the IECC. So there are zero code provisions this is where we start to get people's eyes start to glaze over. There are appendices within the International Energy Conservation Code that outline what a zero code is. And essentially, you're trying to get a building as efficient as you can. There's minimum efficiency requirements for a building. And then whatever's left, whatever energy that building still needs to use, you purchase or install renewables to make up the difference. but different agencies, different organizations, different jurisdictions define zero differently. So that is just how our funding defines zero. Yeah.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Erin. And for those of you who might be wondering, wait, what are those ASHRAE? What are those designations? If you scroll up in the chat, it refers to that map that Kara showed a few minutes ago. So remember, you can scroll up in the chat and see where your jurisdiction, what are the current codes that you've got set for your jurisdiction. Thanks, Erin. I've got some more questions for you, but I want to hear the city perspective. So Brad, welcome. Welcome to you and the city of Fort Collins, Colorado. Really excited to hear about the work that you're leading. Can I first just ask, it feels like Fort Collins is really a leader in this space, and I'd love for you to tell us a bit about your journey to where y'all are right now.
Yeah, well, thanks, Tina, and thanks, Erin, for kicking this off and making some really good points. And I want to first say I do appreciate in the title slide that it still listed my title as Energy Code Compliance Specialist. My title and role has changed a little bit, but I really, really, really like to put an emphasis on compliance. And I think Erin brought that up as well as something that's really critical in all of this moving forward. So how did we reach the point we're at today? Honestly, I would love to take 100% credit for it, but I can't. There were people that were here before me, and there were people that were doing some pretty amazing work in the city of Fort Collins prior to me coming on board, which was about 7 years ago. So really, what I do is really just kind of a continuation and an expansion of what we've put in place years ago, and we continue to build upon. So credit goes to all of those people that were there before me. More importantly, I think, is our development of our climate plan. And within our climate plan, we set the bar really high, and we have several different what we call moves within that climate plan that allow us across the city to kind of establish goals that relate to the work that we all do. That climate plan, which is what we call our climate future, really drives the work that most of us in sustainability, and I work in our Fort Collins Utilities, our energy services division. So really that informs the work that we do every day. There is a provision within that climate plan that is called efficient emissions-free buildings. And most of my work falls within that move. And within that move, we have a next move to develop a performance path to zero carbon building by year 2030, reaching for that. And Erin kind of touched on this, we all kind of define this a little bit differently. There's zero energy, there's zero carbon in our case. So we're all kind of putting our own definition behind it. And we recognize that certainly we do as a home rule jurisdiction, we can adopt and enforce the code that we see fit as we see fit and as it aligns with the work that we need to do. We recognize not every jurisdiction, not every state can do that. And I think that's where, things like compliance really come into this, and using resources at the state level, local level to make sure that you are as compliant as you can be to energy code. So that's kind of where it started.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, and tell us a little bit about how you started thinking about updating your code and where are you today? So sharing some of the great work and the current status of that great work that you and then others have contributed to. And in particular, I'm interested to hear about how you've used technology to measure code compliance.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's something that I'll first have to preface this a little bit in that we're a little unique in that we are a municipal utility. So we're able to kind of get our hands on some stuff that not everybody can. But as a result of that, we recognize that other people can learn from the work that we're doing. So we very much kind of embody that role in our work. That we're okay being leaders as long as we can put some information available and out to the community that others can learn from. So I think for the most part, it really started with just that, recognizing that, we needed to focus work on a couple things. One, adopting code on a regular cycle. So within our climate future plan, we have put some provision in place to adopt the code within 1 year of issuance from the International Code Council. So you can kind of guess where we're at this point. So we are currently on the 2021 body of codes that includes the energy code. We also, as a home rule jurisdiction, do amend that code to align with where we are heading in the future and where our climate future plan tells us we need to go with our buildings. In Fort Collins, over 60% of our buildings are over 60% of our emissions come from our built environment or our buildings. So on a national level, we showed the earlier slide a little over 40%. Well, we're well over 60% here. So we need to address buildings. We need to address the existing buildings, and we need to address new construction. Compliance is a big part of that moving forward. We build anywhere from, we probably have somewhere in the range of 400 to 500 new buildings and new homes built every single year. So those new buildings continue to make up a higher percentage of what's built in our built environment. And the more we reach and push and stretch those codes, the higher performance we get out of the overall building stock. So as a result of that, we use kind of technology, I guess, and more or less data, really, to kind of lean on data, kind of inform us, like in the very beginning, like what is our compliance rate? And fortunately, we had the opportunity to participate in the project from City Energy Project. And I think, Aaron, that's maybe we got our start in our connection with you through that. But leveraging those opportunities. So that's, again, as you see opportunities arise, make the connection, see if your city or your jurisdiction can participate in some of these programs. And that allowed us to kind of establish what we call baseline energy code compliance rate. From there, we just took that baseline compliance rate and then we kind of built a tracking mechanism to find out exactly where we sit citywide as we continue to track like the touches that we would have on certain projects. So we knew our baseline energy code compliance rate was, and we also were analyzing utility energy use of buildings to determine more or less, like as we adopt code, as we put compliance improvements in place, resources, education materials, trainings, are we seeing the energy use? Are we reduce every time we adopt code? And are we seeing the compliance rate to energy code improve over the years? And fortunately, we are. We started out at an initial compliance rate of about 73%. I believe that's better than the national average. And I would say, I think we're better than a lot of jurisdictions nationwide. And I would say that, even though we all strive to be 100% compliant, I think that's really, really, really difficult to achieve. And right now we're probably in the mid to high 80% in terms of compliance rate. So using data, working with our data analysts to build a tracker and then put that into a way to track and show the community that even though we push and we stretch for these codes, it actually is reducing energy use in our built environment.
That's really helpful. And I want to just like pause for a moment and recognize that over half of our attendees mentioned that their cities are just starting on this journey and starting to think about updating the energy code. So I feel like, Brad, what you just shared, I think is going to be so helpful. So I'll put a plug. If folks have questions, drop them in the chat. We'll invite you to come off mute if you're available to ask your question yourself, but really want to make sure this is valuable to those of you who are getting started on this journey in your jurisdictions. And Brad, is there any, if you're able to, it could be great to see that tracker itself, if that's something that you can share or bring up just to bring it to life a little bit.
Oh, I can. It's a spreadsheet. It's not real pretty.
Okay. Don't sweat it. Don't sweat it. Well, actually, Brad, I have one more question for you. Don't sweat the tracker. Yeah. But I think it's just a great example of where you're collecting data and you're using it, right? Yeah. You're putting it into work to achieve your goals. One thing that I think folks might be wondering as they get started on this journey is around how did you approach your state Department of Energy or the equivalent, and how are you in Fort Collins working with other jurisdictions in Colorado?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I think it really is an important question for the group. We're really lucky, and I have to give a lot of credit to our state office, what we call our Colorado Energy Office. That team has always been very accessible. and always willing to lean in as jurisdictions sort of work to advance energy code and their efforts. So the other thing is, I'll say that the state of Colorado has recently become, I think, very progressive in this work. And we've been very fortunate in what the Colorado Energy Office has put together and developed. So they have Building Energy Codes webpage. So I would encourage people to just Google Colorado Energy Office Building Energy Codes webpage. And it's at least something that people could look at and maybe use to kind of, shoot for. And I'm sure there are other state energy offices that are doing some similar work and amazing work. But they have really established some amazing trainings and resources on that page. So all of that being said, it's just, I guess, the recognition of some of the jurisdictions in Colorado, ourselves, Fort Collins, City of Denver, and City of Boulder, that tend to really push and stretch this. Most of these jurisdictions that I just mentioned sit along the major corridor of building, really, in the state. The bulk of the population lives within this vertical corridor from north to south. And that includes those three jurisdictions. We're all doing something similar, and as a result, I think Colorado Energy Office has been very open to learning from what we've done, and then bring what we've done into some of the resources and trainings that they've put in place. But still, regardless of that, they've done some amazing work. The other thing, of course, is our Colorado State Legislature has recently put out some House bills that have really pushed us and the state to develop and reach for higher performance in energy codes. So we really rely on that work. And then as a result of that Colorado legislature work, there was a state energy code board established. So a lot of the jurisdictions have leaned in and are now part of that state energy code board. I sit on that state energy code board as well. So it gives all of these jurisdictions a chance to connect and see the work that we're all doing, and then bring that forward into the development of some future codes that will be implemented at the state level. Then on top of that, we have a state energy code collaborative, and that's really developed through our RIO, our Regional Energy Efficiency Organization. There's an acronym for you, Aaron. So we do it too in local government. So leaning on Southwest Energy Efficiency Project to bring a bunch of jurisdictions together. And then the Colorado cities, there's a new cohort that's been, we've just initially kind of kicked off, and I think we'll learn more of what this is going to look like, but it's some of the leading jurisdictions on energy code. So we call it right now just the Colorado cities energy code cohort. We're all kind of moving in the same direction. We all recognize that we share trades across these jurisdictions, and it would be beneficial to somewhat standardize and align the work that we have in front of us. So just any chance and opportunity you get to lean in with other people that are doing amazing work is really important to the work that we do too.
That's fantastic. It's great to hear how y'all have sort of organized within the state. And my hope is that for some of the folks on today's call, this can feel like that sort of initial sense of community for you to tap into for inspiration and community as you engage on this work. We've been getting some questions in the chat, and I'm going to go to those in a moment. But first, Brad, something you touched on when you were speaking about how the data and technology have been incorporated into this code compliance work. You mentioned that the data has been helpful when you engage with community. And I'd love to hear you share who have been the most important community partners for you and constituents in this journey as you have reformed your code.
Yeah, well, we have, we have our building community, and I would say certainly first and foremost, they're a really important partner in this. And being willing to engage with them every chance you get is critical. It's one thing to just put a code in place, but really the building community needs to come along, and they need to understand that the work that they're putting in, because as we put an advanced energy code in place, they certainly recognize that they're doing things in our jurisdiction they don't have to do in neighboring jurisdictions. And just being willing to engage with them and to listen to them is really important. I learn things every single time we talk to them about, like, oh, we put a code in place, and oh, well, it turns out there's some things that may be a little more challenging than I thought when we initially implemented the code and didn't have the entire group, the entire building community in front of us. We just had a handful of partners that engage on our code review committees. So they're important. And then certainly other groups within town. We have sustainability groups in town that really kind of help us bring awareness of this work and the importance of the work. So engaging with those groups as well, sustainability groups. There's a legislative group in town that is engaging with us right now to help us develop trainings. So it doesn't fall just on the jurisdiction. And I think that's one really important thing to look at, like our future plans. We very much recognize that all of this is not just driven by the jurisdiction. It also has to be done at the community level. So looking for those partners to engage with is really important.
Yeah. I'm loving the activity in the chat. So I want to first invite Margie. You dropped in a couple questions. I'm going to pause for a moment in case you want to come off mute and ask Aaron and Brad. Let's start with one question, just so we can cycle around to the other audience members. Go ahead, Margie.
Thanks all. Margie Lynch, Jackson Hole Climate Action Collective. Thanks to you all for pulling this together. Brad, great to see all the awesome work going on in Fort Collins. One thing I'm curious about here in Jackson, though we have a lot of robust building activity, we don't have an organized building community. And so I think one, potential barrier to more advanced work is how we do effectively engage with the building community. And I was wondering if you or others here have any insights for how to get something like that going. Sensitive to the fact that we're outsiders, like trying to tell them that this would be valuable. And it seems like it really needs to arise from within. And just welcome any insights people have about how we can engage with an unorganized building community.
It's a really great question. And first, I'm just going to put a plug in for my role with the city. I recognize that most jurisdictions don't have this role, don't have somebody dedicated to energy code specifically within your jurisdiction. So any chance I get to plug that, I'm like, hey, maybe it would be great to have, an energy code person on staff. But recognizing that isn't possible for everybody. But likely either one, you have staff that is a building services staff, that's a building inspection team or a plan review team, building review technicians and whatnot, or you outsource that to some sort of code entity. I would certainly say for me, getting the buy-in from the building community has been my willingness to one, meet him on site from time to time and work through some complex issues. The conversation really changes, even if it's just once a week. Just like if you're working through something with a builder and there's a challenging detail or issue that you're going through, just leaving the desk and going out on site. Sometimes that 2 hours on site will just pay huge dividends in the future. And they really, the building community really appreciates that. More so than I ever thought they would, because I sit in this role. So be willing to go out on site and see things and be hands-on and let them demonstrate what's going on in the field is really critical.
Thanks, Brad.
As the Fed on the call, I feel the need to plug the amount of funding that's available right now for new construction. And so One, I would just underscore what Brad just said. He's been in his role. He alluded to it. We've run into each other in my prior roles, but he's been in his role for years and has been establishing relationships and been visible in the community. That is critical for establishing trust, having them have someone to go to that they have seen at other events and knows what he's talking about and is tapped into what the city's up to. Having that visible relationship in that role, I just double underline, yes, that is critical. I'd also say there's a bunch of tax incentives. There are a bunch of rebates available right now for new construction and renovations that really help to offset the upfront costs, which is a lot of what you hear from the building community. Like, these additional requirements cost a whole bunch more money. Right now, there's a whole bunch more money to help offset that. So like, this is really an unprecedented and important moment, and underscoring that, you know, we have a lot of resources available right now. Let's get together and talk about what might apply within our jurisdiction. It'd also be helpful.
Unless your state energy office is not pursuing certain pots of money.
Well, and Margie, I think there might be others on the call who could relate to you on that. So it could be some good fodder for follow-up. I want to pose a question that Zara from Detroit put in the chat. And Zara, I'll invite you to come off on camera and off mute if you'd like to pose the question yourself. Let me give Zara a moment. Yeah, Zara, go ahead.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
So my question was essentially, you mentioned earlier that you collaborated with the DOE to establish the compliance tracker. I want to know specifically what program that you kind of started you off on that.
And after Brad responds to that, Aaron, I'd love to hear sort of, is there any upcoming funding that could help other jurisdictions fund this type of work?
Yeah, hi Zara, thanks for the question. So it actually wasn't the DOE, it really started with City Energy Project and developed just kind of organically. That is some of the things that I had been thinking. So I think, again, to kind of reinforce just like when an opportunity presents itself, you know, maybe do a little bit deeper dive into, you know, how that may impact your work, or, you know, something that you can then build upon in the future. So what started off as something really simple with that City Energy Project program developed into us, you know, creating a more robust compliance tracker. And it still informs the work that we have today. You know, the most important thing that I say in all of this is, like, we push really hard in code, and it's really helpful for me to be able to show the building community and to be honest, our city council and city management, that even though we are pushing hard and sometimes there is additional burden in cost to construction, that we are lowering energy use every time we adopt and implement these reach codes or stretch codes, or actually we just call them building codes, advanced building energy code.
And then in answer to the question about funding, so I mentioned those two buckets of funding, the RESI and the IRA codes funding. Both can support compliance activities. So my office specifically, I sit at the Office of State and Community Energy Programs. We are charged with that $1 billion bucket of funding. We put out last week 400 million of that in the form of formula for states and territories to adopt prescribed codes that are in the statute. So that's IECC 2021 and ASHRAE 90.1 2019, and then strengthening amendments beyond that. So first I'd say, check in and see if your state is pursuing that funding. They have to opt in and say, we want to receive this funding, and then that can be used for adoption. But I like to say that getting a policy passed or getting a code passed is getting yourself to the starting line. So a big chunk of that funding is for implementation and deployment. And so that's really important, that the compliance processes are in place, that compliance is being measured, that these things are being established so that those processes ideally outlive the funding and become part of the way that the jurisdiction operates going forward. So the funding can be used for that. What we put out last week is for states and territories. $1 billion minus $400 million is $600 million. So we have a bunch left. And later this year, knock on wood, There will be a different announcement for a broader constituency of grantees. Our statute allows us to grant to states and local governments who have the authority to adopt building codes. So if you find yourself in that position, you're an eligible grantee for the competitive funding that is forthcoming. So I can make sure folks have links to how you can subscribe to newsletters, et cetera, to be updated on when that funding becomes available. But I'd say in the near term, to just take stock of where you are. See if your state is planning on taking their formula funding for what we announced last week. See who in your jurisdiction is currently working on energy codes and where the gaps are and what that funding could be helpful for adoption, but also where do you need additional gap filling for implementation? Do you need workforce training? Do you need capacity building? Do you need outreach and education? Just understand what those gaps are so that you can start to think about what a project might look like under that funding.
Erin, I love this practical advice. Again, with so many folks on today's session being sort of starting out on this journey, that's all so helpful. And we want to double down there. Kara, let me invite you in to, so we can, again, be bringing as much relevant and actionable information to our attendees today.
Yeah, Erin, I just had a follow-up question on that. So there's the $1 billion that you alluded to that's going directly to state and local governments for updating their codes and then compliance activities. And then there's the RECE or RECI grant that mostly went to technical assistance organizations to support state and local governments in their code implementation, from what I understand. And I was hoping you could speak to how cities that are further along earlier in their journey should think about potentially reaching out to those technical assistance organizations to do things like building a community or figuring out where they are in their process and the role of kind of those middlemen nonprofit in helping people level up.
That's a great question. And I might ask, so my colleague Harry Bergman is in the shadows on this call. I might ask him to drop the link to the RECI FOA award winners in the chat, just so folks can go to those and see what the nonprofits who received those funding streams are. There are a few who are putting together cohorts to tackle issues like traditional building codes, innovative building codes like the building performance standards. And I just say getting in the loop with those organizations. They exist and their projects exist to get you the information that you need. If you take nothing else away from this call, this work has been going on for a while, and likely someone has invented the wheel before you and wants to help you put the wheel on your car. So the best place to start is probably with those, the list of awardees. They likely have points of contact, or the organization will have a point of contact. And then I'd say the RECI folks are putting out other rounds of funding in the future. So that list may get expanded. And then there's a whole network of folks who haven't even received funding through RECI who still work on energy codes and are likely to be tied in. So I'd say as a place to start with that list, if a point of contact's not listed, go to the organization's website and send them an email. I promise you they want to work with you.
That's great. Thank you, Erin. I love taking the metaphor one step further around recreating the wheel, because you are so right. There are so many who want to help get that wheel in the car, and a lot of them are on today's call. So just remember that we sort of hope that this is a community that folks can tap into. Next, I want to go to a question that Tanya from Jackson, Wyoming shared in the chat. Tanya, if you want to come off mute and pose your question to Brad and Erin, please go ahead.
Hi, apologies that Jackson is dominating the chat. Margie is a couple miles down the road from me right now. But I guess we're very excited and interested. And she already mentioned, we have challenges. The state is not Colorado. So, I'll just put it out there. Our biggest fear is that when we adopt, the 2021 IECC code, when we do things like that, that the state will say, oh, you can't do that. You have to, our state, you can't go higher than some very, very old code, similar to what Idaho has done. So we have to be very careful around things like that. But my question, so you can comment on that if you'd like, if you have suggestions. My comment was also, we should be really working together with the people working on affordable and workforce housing. And we have been talking about, energy costs are a part of affordability and taking that bend, but I still get a lot of pushback when working towards any kind of energy efficiency because of the perceived added cost, added time. Time is money, and housing is really the crisis that has gone to the top right now. And so how do you work with that? You already mentioned, Aaron already mentioned, in a previous response, some of the federal funding that may or may not be available in our state in different forms, but any other suggestions, I'm all ears.
Yeah, we're not immune to that, Tanya, at all. We are a community that is seeing a lot of growth and has seen a lot of growth. And with a lot of growth, there's a lot of demand for housing. And I think, generally speaking, at any given time in Fort Collins, we always need 500 new houses or housing developments or whatever. I would say houses. So affordability is always something that comes up. And it's something that, we have really, I guess, especially even in this last 2021 code adoption, really taken a hard stance on in our commitment to equity within the community, realizing that there is a push to develop, less expensive housing, but we don't want that to come at a cost of the quality of housing, and especially quality of housing for affordable housing developments. So we've really put our foot down on that. We're also, we lean on the work that's already been done. So the DOE determinations that every code cycle through P&L, that information is something that we bring forward, and we're very transparent with the building community and our city council and city management on. So bringing those numbers to them. And then we also have asked building partners, again, engaging with the building community, ask them to provide, some additional dollars on top of that. Like we may be proposing X on top of the building energy code. If you have, some cost numbers that we can include in that, we're happy to maybe include those in the cost estimates for whatever the cost of construction might be if we're bringing it forward. But then the most important thing, in all honesty, is making sure that everybody knows that building energy code specifically is the one code that actually does pay back to the people living in those houses or apartments or affordable housing communities. So I think the general number is typically for every dollar spent on building energy codes, there's $11 returned in benefit. So I think if you separate building energy code out, it's going to be a little bit less than that, but it is the only code that actually gives those people to live in that housing a return. So enforcing those things, and then also just asking the building community, if you have different numbers, please provide them. And, engage with one or two, like insulation contractors. What was it like to go from R49 to R60? What's that additional cost? Bring that to us. We're happy to say, okay, well, that's $300 more for every house built. Sure, we'll include that in our cost of construction, and we bring that to city council. The numbers end up not being as big as most people think at the end of the day. So, but again, it's giving those community members, that building community members, a voice as well.
Thanks, Brad. And Tanya, I think it sounds like the situation and the challenge you're facing in Jackson, I am sure that other cities on the call today are facing that tension point around housing affordability. So thanks for being here and being a part of the conversation. We've got about 10 minutes left. Kara, I'm going to come to you for one more question for our speakers. Take it away.
Yeah, it's just a follow-up question to the one that was just asked. I guess I'm just curious, Erin, one thing that really struck me about the $400 million that's currently available is that it seems to be prorated, weighted towards places that are further behind in their code journey. And so I'm thinking about some of the cities that may have to, or be in a position where there's somewhat difficult conversations with the state. Given that there is more money available often for those places, what would you actually like to see in terms of an application from a city that is still on, say, 2009 code? And do you have any advice for folks about how they can start to have that conversation with their state?
That's a great question. And I love that you read the ALRD that closely. That's amazing. Yes, we rated the funding partially based on how far you have to go, realizing that states and cities that are further behind are going to probably need more resources to get up to the current code. So our statute requires adoption of the latest model code or zero codes. The RESI funding is a little bit more flexible, just to continue reiterating what those different buckets of funding are. We need to see coming up to the latest model codes or zero codes as part of the Inflation Reduction Act funding. And so those states that are receiving formula funding or that opt in to receive formula funding, that is the requirement for receiving funding. And so engaging with your state and making that point, like, hey, we really support coming up to the latest model codes. Here's how we'll engage on the implementation side. We can get extra money because we're further behind, just the way this award is structured, I think be really helpful. The funding is meant to be layered. So if your state is further behind and it's not feasible to come up to the latest model codes right now, I'd say pursue the RESI funding that can support adoption of a more current code and then layer on top of that to the latest model code. So not being able to come up to the latest model codes does not mean that your state cannot pursue funding. We have these buckets of funding that are meant to be layered together and used together. And so I just encourage, to the extent that your state is willing to accept support from the federal government, I would encourage engaging with them and making these points that, like, this money is available. We support it. We're going to be doing, as a local jurisdiction, we'll be doing a lot of the heavy lifting on the implementation side, because that's just how codes shake out. And we support it and we'd want to see this happen. I'd say probably the most impactful thing to be doing.
That's great. I really love Erin. Erin is continuing to give some really great practical advice. And that is sort of what the last question I have for both Erin and Brad is about. You both have given some really fantastic advice over the course of this conversation. I'm going to invite you, as you think about where our audience is, what's the one piece of practical advice that when folks drop off the Zoom call and they're reflecting on, wow, like the opportunity, the funding opportunities, but also the partnership and engagement opportunities, Brad, that you've shared. What is one piece of practical advice that you have for cities in terms of how they should take the next right step? I'll invite either of you to come off mute and share first, and then we're going to launch some final poll questions. But Erin, why don't you go ahead first?
I'm going to answer your question a little bit cheating, because I'm just going to summarize 3 things we've already said. So not newly answer the question. So I get 3 things because I'm not newly answering it. 1, take stock of where you are. You'd be surprised how much of a useful exercise it is to just ask around, especially if you don't already know, how do we deal with energy codes? What is the state of energy codes in our jurisdiction and our state? So take stock, take advantage of the ecosystem of support that exists out there, both from the federal government, but also from NGOs and organizations that exist to support this sort of activity and collaboration between peer cities and states. And then engage with your state, especially a little bit of a self-serving promotion, but especially because we released that funding for the states last week. We want to see local jurisdictions involved in those states' applications too, because it's so important at the local level that the implementation happens and passes from state to local. So take stock of where you are, take advantage of the ecosystem that's out there, and engage with your state if you're not already engaged.
Boy, I don't know of any way to put it other than to just echo really what she said. I think I'll circle back to, like, when I first started with the city of Fort Collins, one of the first things that I did was connect with our regional energy efficiency organization and just find out, like, how they get assisting the work that we were doing and, like, what they do and then what they bring. Ours is SWEEP, Southwest Energy Efficiency Project. So they still continue to engage with us on a very regular basis and help us in the work that we do. And that's not just the work that we do, the city of Denver does, the city of Boulder does. That's across the entire state. So even those jurisdictions that are struggling, that may not even have an energy code in place, or may not have a workforce, or, you know, the ability to train, workforce, community, building community members or staff on that stuff. So, and often they'll loop us into those conversations. So from time to time, those jurisdictions will email me and say, hey, how did you do X and X and X? And what did it take from a workforce standpoint? Or how do you enforce this, within your building services division? So really engaging with that organization. And of course, for the work that, Aaron and the DOE is doing is really, they also connect us to a lot of opportunities. So using those partnerships to connect with opportunities and find out if there are connections across communities as well. So to engage in some of these grant and funding opportunities.
That's great. Really appreciate that. Again, really practical advice from both of you. And really, what you've both done in that advice is reiterate the value and unique role that partnerships play here. It's a really important reminder that for those of you on the call working in cities across the country, you're not alone, right? You might feel like that some days as maybe the only person in your jurisdiction working on something, but Brad's point about finding others that you can connect with and engage with and collaborate with is a great one. Now, we're going to prompt 2 more poll questions to wrap up. And while you're looking at those, I want to invite Jamie Lavin from Bloomberg Philanthropies to give us a preview of some other content in the local infrastructure hub that could be valuable for all of you.
Thank you so much, Tina, and thank you to Erin and Brad and to Kara so much for today's dialogue. I love hearing about cities that were inspired to get started before some of this historic federal funding was available, and can then therefore give blueprints and inspiration to cities that are now undertaking ways to be able to put those funds into action. So just want to plug another branch of support that we have through the Local Infrastructure Hub. For cities with a population of 150,000 or less, we have grant application boot camps. And if you aren't familiar with our boot camps yet, they're in partnership with the National League of Cities. And really they take city participants from the beginning of their journey with applying for a grant all the way through what does a persuasive narrative look like, and making sure that your grant application hits all the points that those who will be scoring it are looking for. So how to pull together the data that you need for the application, how to make sure that you have the right partnerships in place. We heard so much about partnerships today. So we have 2 different kinds of boot camps open right now. We have boot camps that will do that soup through nuts on RAISE, the RAISE program with DOT, and digital equity. So important for the broadband funds. We also are piloting a climate action boot camp, and the climate action boot camp is going to provide participants with a landscape analysis of what are all the different ways that you can be moving on your climate priorities, and then what is the different funding available for those that's going to be opening in the near term. And once cities figure out what their projects are and what their priorities are, they can go into tracks based on clean energy, clean buildings, or clean air, and what are the different funding streams. So for instance, heavy duty electric vehicles, and we can support you then in filing your application for that specific one. And we have a whole bench of climate partners who are going to be plugging in and giving their guidance there. And then we have a third type of support. If any of the cities on this call have applied for the BRIC program or FMA through FEMA and haven't been successful before, or were near applying and didn't quite get there, meaning you're not a beginner, we also are pairing you with consultants who will help you improve the parts of your application that maybe in the feedback session with FEMA they highlighted need some more support. So just want to plug those. And if anyone needs any more information, I'm sharing the link in the chat to register. You can also reach out to me anytime, and I'll put my email here in case you say, you know what, I'm not really sure what I should be doing, which one I should be applying for. Happy to help you figuring out. I think I should put a comma instead of a dot between Bloomberg and org, so to make sure to correct that on your side. And lastly, I just wanted to also say, please continue checking out our site. I put a link to 2 upcoming sessions that we're doing on resilience. So likely of import to this group. The first is on October 10th, and it's going to be focused on some of the funding that's available through FEMA and NOAA to mitigate flooding problems in your communities. We're going to be joined by our friends from Urban Sustainability Director Network and some speakers from FEMA. So stay tuned for more information. And then on October 11th, the following day, we'll also be focusing on resilience and really what's the right use case for digital twins to help with resilience. We've seen really effective examples, especially with fire prevention. And so, so we'd love to be part of that. And I saw a question in the chat as about the boot camps. Yes, the cutoff is 150,000 or less for population. But if you are a city that's a little over 150,000, please feel free to register or reach out to me. I think we are more than happy to bring cities in, but we really are also trying to make sure that those cities who feel like federal funding hasn't been accessible to them before get the resources and the support they need to be able to compete for these dollars. So thank you, Tina. Thank you to Kara. Thank you to our speakers, and we'll see you at our next session.